There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on. Hello and welcome to Mamamia Out Loud. It's what women are actually talking about on Wednesday, the 20th of September. I'm Holly Wainwright.
I'm Mia Freedman.
And I'm Clare Stevens.
And on the show today, do the partners of problematic men owe us anything? The conversation swirling around Bijou Phillips and Laura Brand today. Plus, what is an Office 10? Welcome to the law of attraction we're all familiar with, but now has a name. Plus, can your friendships survive the ultimate stretch when one of you has a baby and one of you does not? But first, Clare Stevens.
In case you missed it, I have been vindicated. The men really are thinking about the Roman Empire far too much. So on Monday's show, my recommendation was to go up to a man in your life and ask him how often he thinks about the Roman Empire. It's a viral trend on TikTok, and it's thought to reveal something about the mental load that men have plenty of time to ponder ancient civilizations, women perhaps don't. Of course, I pointed out I actually think about the Roman Empire a lot, so it is not strictly divided by gender lines. But the Out Louders, they took my advice. I am now the recommendation queen. They took my advice and the responses are hilarious. Somebody asked, did you ask a man in your life?
In the Out Louders Facebook group.
In the Out Louders Facebook group. The responses are so good. So some of the responses are, my partner thought I was trying to trick him. My sister's boyfriend said daily that it's about 20% of his YouTube content and he would even break it into Roman, Western and Byzantine empires. Wow. And then another said, mine said never, and then told me a fact about the Roman Empire's sewerage system. So not never then. I asked my son a couple of weeks ago and he said fortnightly. Yesterday he came up to me and started talking about the Colosseum. Somebody else said, I just asked my husband. He legit came back immediately with, a couple of times a week. When I lost it laughing, he was like, what? I think about conquering things, gladiators and shit. I am deceased. I haven't laughed that hard in so long.
I love this one. Mine said he didn't think about it at all, then proceeded to tell me he's read 13 books about it in the last 2 years, but isn't currently thinking about it.
It's so
Do you know what
good.
I love about this one is that, I always like reaching for a topic of small talk, and Lord knows I'm bored of art talking about the weather, particularly at the moment because it's hot. But I really love asking this question. I was in a work dinner last night. There was a table of men and women and the answers were really interesting, like the men did. And then the next thing I discovered, which is the next question to ask, how often do you think about a zombie apocalypse and what you would do?
Yeah.
And the two men at the table had really quite detailed plans. They'd clearly thought about it a lot. And it's like, I would get a boat and I would get my ute and I would pick up my wife's parents and I would go inland. And the other one's like, no, I would try to get a boat and I would get my dog and I would go out to sea because the zombies aren't going to get you at sea. And then the other guy's
Zombies
like,
can't swim, everybody
what about
knows that.
food? And it was just really interesting.
The things that occupy our brain space. So Out Louders, jump in the Facebook group. Keep letting us know your answers. They are cracking us up.
Leave him. Leave him immediately. That is what we demand of the wives of problematic men. And today it happened when Bijou Phillips, who is the wife of convicted rapist actor Danny Masterson, filed for divorce. We spoke quite a bit about him last week. He's the That 70s Show guy who has been sentenced for 30 years in prison for his assault of 3 women. And until this announcement, there had been plenty of headlines targeting her for supporting her husband of 12 years throughout his trial. Yesterday, her statement read, via her attorney, Ms. Phillips has decided to file for divorce from her husband during this unfortunate time. Her priority remains with her daughter. This period has been unimaginably hard on the marriage and the family. Mr. Masterson was always present for Ms. Phillips during her most difficult times of her life. Ms. Phillips acknowledges that Mr. Masterson is a wonderful father to their daughter. The other woman that everyone's waiting to call a lawyer is Laura Gallagher. She's the wife of Russell Brand. Actually, I think she's Laura Brand now. They refer to her as Laura Brand on their joint channels. Laura is pregnant with their 3rd child, and she's been married to him for 6 years, although they initially dated way before that, before he kind of became a massive Hollywood celebrity and then guru when she was only 18. as we're talking today, she has stayed completely silent on the allegations against her husband that exploded on the weekend and have now seen him cancel his tour, have his revenue cut off by YouTube, and finally become the subject of a police investigation. I want to talk about what we expect from these women, right? Remember when Harvey Weinstein's wife, Georgina Chapman, who was a really fancy fashion designer, who was behind a label called Marchesa that all the celebrities wore all the time. And after the allegations exploded around Weinstein, there was kind of a boycott of that brand, an enormous amount of pressure on her to speak out and divorce him. And she finally did, but not until 2021, which was about 4 years afterwards, because I guess the settlement was being knocked out until then.
That was slightly different because it was well known that Marchesa benefited hugely from the influence and the bullying of Harvey Weinstein, who, as you say, bankrolled it, but also forced and put a lot of pressure on actresses who starred in his movies to wear her outfits on the red carpet. That literally was a label that was built on his predation and his poor behaviour.
But do you remember that Scarlett Johansson wore one as a support for Georgina and she got slammed for it?
That was after he went to jail.
Anna Wintour tried to kind of relaunch it in Vogue and basically said it's unfair of us to hold Georgina accountable for Harvey's actions, and it started this really interesting conversation.
Well, that's what I want to talk about, because I want to know what we want from the women who seem, at least initially, to be standing by their men. Mia.
I remember having this thought and feeling very strongly about it when the actor Robert Hughes, who was the Hey Dad actor, was tried and then convicted of child sexual abuse quite a few years ago. And his wife was a famous agent, a woman called Robin Gardner, and she was representing a lot of celebrities at that time. And there was a lot of conversation around how could she be with this man after he was convicted. Now, he served his jail time. He then came out of jail and they're still together. I think she stepped back from her business or sold it, and they're still together and she's continued to stand by him. Similarly, Rolf Harris's wife, Bill Cosby's wife. There are a lot of men whose wives do stick around, and it's hard not to judge them. I'll be honest, it's hard.
There's an Australian academic called Dr. Lauren Rosewarne, and she coined this term a few years ago, sexually transmitted ethics. And it's the idea that we love to hold women accountable for the behaviour of men, and that it goes both ways. When there's a really charismatic, lovable guy, we extend that to their female partner. And when there's a really problematic guy, we extend those values to their partner in a way that doesn't go in the reverse, because we see men as kind of these self-contained, standalone beings that aren't implicated in other people's behaviour necessarily. Of course, part of it makes sense because there's the cliche, if you lie down with dogs, you get fleas. And there's also the idea that the people around a predator were complicit. That
I don't think that's fair.
Well, that they may have known, that they may have, benefited from what these people were doing. And often we have this bias where we think surely you would have to know if your husband or partner was this kind of person, the kind of person who hurts people. Surely if your husband was a rapist, you would have to know. But I think we've learnt time and time again that you don't necessarily.
Of course not.
And there are people who discover that their partner had a secret family or a secret gambling addiction or engaged in criminal behaviour. And there's also really fascinating psychology around seeing what we want to see and ignoring what we don't want to see. But something that worries me a little bit is this idea that women are always subject to manipulation. So, for example, one of the arguments when it comes to Russell Brand, when it comes to Danny Masterson, is these people, the way they get away with what they did for so long is that they are charming and they're manipulative. So that must be what they're like in their intimate partner relationships. But I wonder, especially now, why are we so comfortable to hold men accountable for the behaviour of their friends and not women accountable for their behaviour of their partners?
Do you mean Ashton?
Yes,
Kutcher?
like Ashton Kutcher.
But the other issue that I think is really worth mentioning is that if this is a pattern of behaviour, which it plainly is for Russell Brand, and there was news this week that he's been demonetised from YouTube, the BBC have taken down his videos, There's police investigations now, and then other women are starting to come forward and going to police. We don't know that his wife was not also a victim of who knows what kind of behaviour.
This is exactly it. I think we're just massively impatient, particularly in our digital media era, to jump to what we feel like. So Bijou Phillips was not allowed to have a week in between her husband being convicted and announcing her divorce without that week being just full of people saying to her, well, clearly this is on you. And it is true that she supported him, and it is true that she wrote him character references. But I think that misunderstands the complexity of relationships, marriages, entrenched family and entrenched finances, wanting to believe the best of this person and then finding out that they're not who you thought they were is devastating for them.
It's true. And in a couple of weeks, I'm interviewing the daughter of Chris and Lynette Dawson, Chanel Dawson. That's a very famous murder case. Chris Dawson was found guilty of murdering his wife, Lynette, that was covered by a podcast called The Teacher's Pet. Lynette and Chris had two daughters. One of them believes that her father did not kill their mother, despite the fact that he's been convicted and is now in jail. And the other one, Chanel, believes that he did. You've also got to put that in there. It's not just about standing by them. Maybe, and people are innocent until proven guilty, although there's a lot of stuff about that Russell's behaviour that's on camera may not be criminal, but I would argue a lot of it kind of is in terms of sexual harassment, grabbing journalists, being revolting in interviews. She might believe him.
Of course.
And Bijou Phillips might have believed Danny Masterson.
One of two things is happening inside their country house right now, right?
Russell Brand
and Laura Brand's house. Either she does believe him because she knew who she was marrying, right? Of course she knew who she was marrying in terms of Russell Brand's public image and his openness about having sex addiction, his openness about promiscuity decade, his openness about all his mental health issues is literally documented in books that he wrote. So it's not like she didn't know about his past. So she either entirely believes him when he says it was consensual and that he's a victim of a conspiracy, or she's having to contend right now that the man that she is literally carrying the child in her belly, that the father of that child is not who she thought he was and that he is the monster that everybody says he is. Now, both of those things are mind-boggling. If you've ever been the victim of a narcissistic dude, if you've ever been deceived by a charming man, you know how complicated that is. Up is down and down is up and you don't know. And I just don't like
She's very vulnerable.
The speed at which we like to point and condemn. And it's interesting because we even notice, you know, in the media we'll see that people are clicking on the stories about the women around these men because we're very interested. And it's interesting. That's why we're talking about it.
Yeah, because women say, what would they do in the same situation?
But it's almost impossible to know. You know, it's almost impossible to know. And then you add in the complexities that are in a lot of women's real lives, celebrities, not millionaires, money and dependence and kids and entangled families. Like, just leave him is just kind of almost ridiculously simplistic advice.
And I get that. But I do really worry about a world where we see women only as victims.
I don't see her as a victim. That's not what I'm saying for a minute. I'm not suggesting that she's a victim. I'm just saying what she would be going through in this moment is really complicated. So I don't mean necessarily poor her, she's just a victim of this narcissist. But what I mean is it's just so much more layered than it is to just be like, clearly, if she does not divorce him, preferably by this time next week, she condones all those allegations. She doesn't care about the women that he's hurt. She doesn't care about rape victims. She is not accountable for his actions. I do not.
No, I agree. This idea that women are accountable for the actions of their co-workers or their partners or like that's just not fair.
There has been a huge movement. We talked about it on Monday about looking at men and looking at the people that they're friends with and wondering, you know, whether just being friends with them is an act of complicity. And we look at Hollywood and we look at the men that have been protected, the men that have protected other men. And I guess my question is, if we're willing to afford that grace to women, that women have been manipulated by a narcissist and a sociopath, then can't the men around them as well?
We can extend that grace to men. What we were discussing on Monday about that Scottish comedian, Danny Sloss, who's pushing men to call out men's problematic behaviour. He's asking men to step in and stop. It's a different thing. That's a different issue. He's not necessarily saying if you're friends with someone who turns out to be a rapist, that's your fault. He's not saying that. He's just saying men need to call each other out. And we've discussed it before. It's actually the only thing that works. That level of peer pressure from man to man in a toxic masculinity situation is the only thing that will work. I think it's a different situation.
What do you think is the biggest stretch point in a friendship? On No Filter this week, I interviewed two of Australia's most well-known and successful journalists, Leigh Sales and Lisa Miller. Leigh, of course, you know who she is. Lisa Miller, you would also recognise her face. She is a co-host on ABC News Breakfast at the moment. They also happen to be best friends, which is something that not everybody knows. And in our conversation, we talked about the stretch point in friendships. So the stretch point means those times in a friendship where things become a little bit strained and a little bit stretched. And sometimes, for whatever reason, it will stretch and it will break. Other times it will bounce back over time. And sometimes the stretching leaves it just a bit loose and slack and not as close or tight as it once was. And I specifically asked them about the biggest stretch point in their friendship, because at one point in their lives, Lisa was a foreign correspondent reporting on these absolutely tragic, traumatic world events every single day. And Leigh was at a very different stage of her life. She was at home raising two young children. Here's a little bit of what they said about that time.
You know, I haven't really done a great deal of disaster, reporting like Lisa's done. And then obviously Lisa hasn't raised two kids. And so I guess the challenge comes from you're trying to understand and support the other person, but you can't really understand what it's like when you've worked 21 hours in a row in a earthquake zone for 8 days straight or whatever. So I guess that's where the challenge is there, that you're trying your best to be a supportive friend within the rounds of, I just missed that window to call her because now it's 1 a.m. or...
So there was a piece by The Cut this week that explored how friendships survive so much, but there's one thing that appears to be the biggest stretch point of all, and that is more than marriage, more than a new job, the piece says, more than moving across the country. I think there is nothing that represents more of a challenge or a threat to adult friendships than parenthood. It is the only thing that is permanent and time-bound. It has fundamentally shifted my relationships. It was written by a journalist called Alison P. Davis, who hasn't got children, and she talks about a lot of her friendships that didn't survive when her friends became mothers. You've been on all the sides of this because you had children later than a lot of your friends, and you've also got a lot of friends who don't have children at all. How have you navigated that, and have you found it a great divide in your friendships?
I think if you want your friendships to survive these kind of stretches, you've got to take a long view, right? You've got to wait it out. The reason why this is a massive issue for Alison P. Davis and women who are in the absolute eye of this storm is because when you're in it, in those first few years that your friends become parents and you don't, for them, parenthood is all consuming. But that is a season, right? That is a very, very intense season when that baby is, entirely dependent on your friend, needs the attention all the time. And if they don't have family support around or a bottomless budget, sometimes the baby's got to come, sometimes the toddler's got to come. If you want to see your friend, you've got to put up with that. That's life, right? If you want your friendships to survive this, you have to wait it out. As you said, I didn't have my first child till I was 38. Most of my immediate friends did have kids. And then on the other side of it, a lot of my good old friends don't have kids. Of my good mates who I came up with at college and stuff in England, we're exactly 50-50. There's a group of 6 of us and 3 of us do and 3 of us don't. And even here with my Byron Bay ride or die crew, one of the 3 of us doesn't have kids. So I'm really familiar with how you make it work. And one of the things you have to do is you have to make an effort. It's just a really basic thing that obviously I was one of those people who didn't have kids and was always around babies. And I was a bit like, oh, bloody babies. And sometimes I would be, oh, do they have to come? And that could be a bit tricky. But if my friend had to bring them.
Did you say that or did you just think it?
I would sometimes say, maybe we should reschedule for another time or, try and make arrangements around it. But I also recognized that I had to sacrifice the fact that if I wanted to stay friends with my friends and they couldn't leave their baby behind for whatever reason, then, okay, there was going to be a baby at brunch. And that might be a bit annoying, but that's life. But then also it's about your expectations. If you're the person with children, what do you expect from your friends who don't have them? Because I've got kids now, obviously, have had for a long time. My friends who don't have kids, I kind of expect them to have a passing interest. Some of them do, some of them don't. But I'm not offended if they don't want to sit and talk about my children. And they expect from me that I'm not going to blanket them with parent talk and I'm not going to judge them like so many people in their world do all the time, that their lives are somehow less than because they don't have kids. So you've both got to give and take if you want the friendship to last. That's my view on it.
You're on the cusp of this, Claire.
Yes, I had so many feelings reading this article. I flip-flopped because on the one hand, totally get it. Like sometimes you look at your friend's kid and you're like, I am trying to feel something and I don't feel anything towards this child.
But I don't think you have to. I think that's about the
Exactly.
expectation. You don't have to.
Exactly. The more of my friends have kids, the more honest people are being about like, I don't give a shit if people are interested in my kid. Like that's completely fine. But I did want to challenge the idea that is all through this article that women with kids are sort of some homogenous group where all of them just want to talk about their kids. That's not true. The women that were being described in this article, I don't know them. The idea that every time you meet up with a friend who's just had a baby, all they want to talk about is baby poo, I don't agree. I don't think that that's the case. And I thought it was kind of a bit unfairly stigmatizing of women who have had kids.
Well, but that was the author's experience.
yeah.
Like, it's not stigmatizing. It's just
Well,
what's happened to her.
I think it's probably she's kind of, taking a few examples and extrapolating them to apply to all women with kids.
And also, as I say, there is a time when you first have a baby when it is all consuming. So maybe you go to one lunch when that person has just had like
a poo explosion
the
at
worst world and just needs to talk about it. And then you're like, oh, mate, I'm out. If this is what every lunch is going to be like.
Yeah.
And if you back away at that point, you'll never know whether every lunch is going to be that.
Yes,
will you?
and reading this, I thought there are lots of, stretch moments in friendships, and there are also lots of things you talk about with friends that you may or may not relate to. When somebody gets a job that I don't understand, I endeavour to understand what that job is and what they actually do with their finance job.
Sometimes I don't.
Sometimes I listen. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I listen to someone talk about a TV show they're watching that I don't give a shit about. And you just do, because
Part of
friendship
friendship.
is about trying to understand each other. And I do get that the big challenge is that when a child comes around, there is so much that cannot be communicated because you are biologically programmed to be obsessed with that baby and your friend is not. And I get that there's a lot that can't be communicated. However,
What do you mean can't be communicated?
like how much you freaking love your baby, and you're not going to sit there for 40 minutes being like, she's so cute, I just want to kiss her on the mouth. Like,
But
do you know what I mean?
If my friend had fell in love and wanted to come and talk all about that, I'd also be bored.
Exactly. It's like when a friend has a new boyfriend and they're talking about all their fun in-jokes and how often they're having sex. And you're like, I don't personally care about that, but as a friend, I'm going to talk about that with you because that's what friendship is
once
about.
or twice, and then you're going to
Yeah.
call a moratorium. I think the difference between the examples of other stages of life and TV shows and jobs is the problem with this stretch is there's almost a moral judgment embedded in the elastic, right? Which is having babies is really important and profound, and it's what we were all put here to do. And like, it's a love you'll never experience, blah, 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 blah. Whereas TV shows are not that. And so the person who doesn't have the baby yet can feel sometimes, I think this was really brilliantly explored in Dolly Alderton's novel Ghosts, right? The person who doesn't have the baby is often made to feel, rightly or wrongly, like suddenly all their concerns and their issues and their things are trivial and unimportant. And that's where the tension comes in, which is different from TV shows, jobs, relationships. It's almost been taboo until now, perhaps, to be like, you know what? I don't want to talk about babies and your baby and my life isn't meaningless because I don't have a baby. And I think that's why it's a particularly difficult stretch.
But how much is this idea of, my life isn't meaningless because I don't have a baby, how much of that is projected onto the person who does, and how much of that is really felt by the new mother? And I think it's not just new mothers. I think that what's also different between the TV show and this is that it's your time, it's your identity. And the reason that I really struggle is that I find it very challenging to see my friends when they also have to parent, for the same reason that I don't visit my friends at work, because I need and want their attention and their focus. And when they are constantly, oh, hang on a sec, what, darling, what, I can't deal with that.
That's why communication in friendships is so important, because I think you'll be surprised. I had a friend who had a 3-month-old, and Jess and I were going to dinner and we were tossing up, do we invite her? Is it rude to invite her? Is it actually offensive to even ask? Asked her, she was like, hell yeah, got a babysitter, turned up, had several drinks, and she's like, thank you for freaking inviting me. So I think the idea that all mothers are like that they want their children to be there and they're going to be distracted.
But also, it's not always
true.
about wanting them. Like, if you have a 3-year-old who is needy and you can't leave them and you want to see your friend, sometimes you have to sit through some of those. Like, you know, we talk often about how we're all programmed not to sit in discomfort anymore. If you want your friendship to survive, you're going to have to go. Like, when I had my kids and they were little and we didn't have parents around, there were some people in my life I wouldn't have seen if they'd have said, I don't want to see you if the kid's coming. So I think if that's all the time and it's systemic and they are literally saying to you, I'm now 2 people, not just one. But the whole point of friendship is it's a bit of give and take, right? Like every relationship. So sometimes you've just got to sit there and put up with that annoying thing because it won't be forever.
And it also changes. Like my friend Amelia, who lives in America, she came out to Australia, I can't remember, probably last Christmas. I had met one of her children when he was a baby, but the other one I hadn't met. And so I think you can't have a really close friendship if you've never seen your friend do a thing that's so much part of their identity. And if you've never seen them in that role and you've never met their children, I just think it's really challenging. But back to the stretching thing, and when it springs back, as your children get older, that divide closes.
Yes.
Like if you can get past that early stage, it's completely irrelevant and redundant to me whether my friends have kids or not. I've got both because it's not what our friendship's based on. We never talk about it.
It's a long game. As I say, it's a long game.
Yeah.
So when you're in the middle of it, it feels like forever, but it's a season, it's a moment, and you do have to wait out some of those pooey nappy conversations.
Yeah.
But the parents have to be considerate. Like the parents have to be.
Okay, well, on that point, the sense that I was left with when I finished this article was, what do we expect women to do? Because one, it's freaking women. It's always the mothers. Like there's a little bit of a mention of fathers, but it's women. Women are now annoying if you have kids. And I feel like this is just another load for women to carry. Like, do I have to?
What's the load?
The fact that it's annoying if you have kids.
Like, it's not annoying if you have kids. What she's saying is it's annoying if we can no longer do the things that made our friendship what it is. It's annoying if you only talk about your kids. It's annoying if you only do things with kids involved. So I love that bit where she wrote about how she'd flown from Los Angeles to visit her old friends in New York and she spent the whole time at playgrounds, right? Yeah. Now, I lived through that phase where I spent 50 to 60% of my waking hours in a playground, because when your kids are little, that's what you do. And often you'll say, come with me, we'll get a coffee, because it's the only time you've got to do it. Right?
I would argue that in the article, she said, next time I go, I'm going to plan things and invite them. So I kind of think that's on her. If she was asking the people with kids to plan the activity, it was going to be going to the park. But the thing that annoys me is the idea that there's an example in the story where one of her friends says, I'm having a baby. And it almost sounds like she wants her friend to say, I'm so sorry about what that means for our friendship.
Yeah, because
that's bullshit.
No, she didn't. I'm going to defend this story and this. First of all, this is her experience. And she said this was like my last friend who hadn't had a baby, and it's like they all had. And it does change things, and you do have less in common for a time. And I think that all she's asking for is not for the person with a child to feel bad, but just to be self-aware and just to not assume that your baby is interesting to me or fun for me to hang out with. Just assume that. I think that's basic self-awareness.
I think the self-awareness and the grace is on both sides.
On Monday night, after I listened to Out Loud and you told us how all men are obsessed with the Roman Empire, I decided to test the theory. I went into the kitchen and asked my husband when he last thought about the Roman Empire. He took out his earbuds and said, are you kidding? He was actually listening to a podcast called The History of Rome at that very moment. Thanks, bye.
If you want to make Mamamia Out Loud part of your routine 5 days a week, we release segments on Tuesdays and Thursdays just for Mamamia subscribers. To get full access, follow the link in the show notes, and a big thank you to all our current subscribers. We need to talk about the Office 10. In a viral article in The Cut by Danielle Cohen refers to the 3-9-1 phenomenon, the idea that a person who is normally a 3 becomes a 9 in a closed circuit environment, like a weekend group trip or a university class, but then once you're out of that environment and go into the real world, they plummet to a 1. She says that in adulthood, no environment has as great a distorting effect as the workplace. She defines an Office 10 as a person who falls somewhere between average to mildly good-looking in the world at large, but skyrockets to wildly attractive within the confines of an open concept desk plan. Office 10s rarely manage you or report to you because the closeness would disrupt it. More often than not, they're at kind of the same rung, maybe one or two higher. They don't work closely with you, and no one necessarily is full-blown crushing on the Office 10. It's just that they're here to add a little bit of spice. That's kind of what they're about. Importantly, the Office 10 is born from a combination of scarcity and proximity.
Yes.
An ordinary person becomes extraordinary, and they are desires we fabricate to make our work lives more interesting. It's quite depressing, but this made me think,
why is it depressing?
maybe this is why so many people meet their partners at work.
Well,
Yes.
Because you're a little bit like, oh, you're really sexy. And then you leave and you're like, nah.
But the thing is that if it's going to translate into a relationship, then the 10 has to hold on the outside.
Yeah, it has to be.
Or, you know,
No,
exported.
I disagree because I think that I'm sure that there are going to be outlouders that are thinking, why are we judging people? Why are we giving people numbers?
it's
It's
true.
so reductive. Let's be honest. You don't get to know someone's personality, you know, unless you are visually impaired. But the first experience of someone you have is a visual experience. And so for whatever reason, we find some people attractive and some people less attractive. We're drawn sexually to some people and not others. We then get to know their personalities. So the reason why when people were working from home and pandemics was so bad for a certain type of man, it is exactly this. A lot of people linked it to the rise of the incels because the mid-man or the one in the open market, like on Tinder, in the bar, in a closed environment, he's very good looking. There's more likely that the woman will give him the opportunity to get to know her. We're being reductive by saying women and men, but the person will get to know him. That's when you fall in love. So I would say that the holding for a lot of people is about the person because you can't stay with someone just because you think they're handsome or hot, but you have to actually like them as a person. And what the office does is give people the chance that might not otherwise get the chance in the open market.
It's true. Because they've got high status within that closed environment, you'll make a bit of an effort to get to know them.
Jessie says this all the time. She wouldn't have dated someone who was 7 years younger than her.
No, the boxes were not ticked.
No.
You wouldn't have swiped in that situation. I love this idea, and I think there are other environments because I was thinking back to when I was single and I was like really wanting to meet somebody. And romantic comedies for my generation ruined us forever because people are always bumping into each other under umbrellas in busy city streets and being like, oh, you dropped something. And then like, oh, look at you. You're beautiful.
And then they go home and have sex.
And then they go home and have sex and then they get married. Airports, planes. I used to, when I was single, and it's not necessarily that I was desperate to meet someone and have a relationship, but it was like there's a sense of constant potential when you're in that single phase that like anything could happen today. Like I could bump into someone today who is going to change my life in some way. It doesn't happen so much when you'll bump into people who change your life in other ways. I'd get on a plane and I'd sit there, watch all the people come in and you'd look at, and I'm heterosexual, so I'd look at all the men and I'd be like, I hope he's sitting next to me. Oh, maybe we'll want to share a packet of nuts. Oh, and like what I would consider as my kind of deal breakers in that situation were different than they would have been in a bar. The standards were up and down. And then if a really good looking guy did sit next to you, you'd actually be terrified because you'd think, well, I'm going to fall asleep and I'm going to drool on you and that will be that. But it's so funny, that sense of constant potential. And when you work in lots of female environments, as we have done, I have done most of my career, and so have you, Mia, like men are in such scarcity that their status is immediately raised.
Immediately.
The other environment I think you find the equivalent of an Office 10 is on Kentucky or Top Deck or any kind of travel group. Because when you first get there, you look around and you go, I feel weird. I don't know these people. Within 2 days, you're like, oh, yeah, that guy's so hot and that girl's freaking beautiful. She's a supermodel. Like everything's warped because it is closed circuit.
Also a wedding.
Yes,
massively.
Yes. Because I went straight from an all-girls high school, which I don't think there's more of an example of an Office 10 than an all-girls high school.
Oh, yeah. Well, same. It would be like, we always joke that the school would only employ maintenance guys who were like over 60 because like a thirsty group of hundreds of horny girls, we would just terrorize anyone who was kind of under the age of 40.
I look back on the teacher we all thought was hot and I'm like, oh, come on now, come on. But went straight from all-girls high school, then sitting in a uni tutorial when there was men, I was like, oh my God, that guy doesn't look like he's had a shower in a couple of weeks, but he is sexy. And then the other one is mixed netball. Because there's so few men. And I think they're also doing, it's scarcity, it's proximity, and it's also like you're doing something that's non-threatening to me. And so I like that. I like that very much. The other place where you find an Office 10, I find, is at a doctor's office or a hospital. So I remember going to like a GP in America when I was traveling and I was like, I have like UTI or something and this is very stressful because I'm in Texas, and went and saw a doctor and I was like, hottest man I've ever seen. Looks like Zac Efron.
Really?
But I think it's because I was in a position of need.
Oh, right. And you've got the ability to give me antibiotics. I love
For
you.
my stinging vagina.
Yeah.
I've got a recommendation before we go that is a very specific episode of a podcast. So, very, very famous podcast, This American Life. I haven't actually been listening to This American Life much lately. It was such a massive part of the big podcast resurgence wave, wasn't it?
Pretty much one of the earliest podcasts. It's iconic, but I agree with you. I'm a sporadic listener.
Yes, because it's documentary style and it's brilliant, no question. But I listened to an episode last week called The Call, which is one of those things you consume that then you cannot stop thinking about, and it made me look at something in a different way. So this episode is about a woman called Jessie, or it starts being about a woman called Jessie, who works for a hotline in America called Never Use Alone. Now, I'm sure lots of Outlouders know America, and not only America, but particularly America, is and has been for a decade or so now in the grip of a really horrific opioid epidemic. And Never Use Alone is a hotline, a non-judgmental hotline that has been set up to try and save lives of addicts who might be using by themselves. And they can call a number, and in this case, this woman called Jessie would talk to them about how to minimize the chance of overdose. And she says things like,
you got your door unlocked?
Yeah, it's unlocked now.
Okay. So make sure I'm on speakerphone.
Yep.
You're by yourself in your home, in your apartment?
Yeah.
Okay.
She,
so amazing.
and in the opening of this first episode, she's talking to a young woman called Kimber, and you hear the call. You hear Kimber preparing to inject her drugs.
Very confronting.
It is. It's very confronting.
Because you keep waiting for Jessie to say, are you sure? Like to discourage her from that. But that's not the point of this hotline.
And then what you hear in those opening moments is you hear the young woman who's called Kimber talking to Jessie about what she's about to do, what she's about to inject, how it's going to go. And then Kimber goes silent. And Jessie is just calling her name.
Kimber, I'm going to call your name about one more time, and I'm calling an ambulance. Kimber.
And that is the beginning of an extraordinary piece of reporting that then interviews all the people who go on to be involved in this story. The reason it's such a great episode is, you know, the opioid epidemic is like thrown around all the time. And I'm actually reading a novel that's kind of adjacent to it at the moment, so it's front of mind for me. But it's such a human story that takes it from a different perspective entirely about the people it's affecting. And Jessie and the people who work on that line who are like, we just want to keep people alive. And it's such a profound statement, and it's such a profound thing to do, but it's very confronting. Anyway, I loved it. I love a piece of content that makes you look at things in a different way. You can find it wherever you find podcasts. It's an episode of This American Life called The Call.
Most extraordinary thing I've listened to in such a long time. I can't stop thinking about it. If you're looking for something else to listen to that's in-house, that's got more of our voices in it, check out the subscriber episode from earlier this week where we did more questions from the Proust questionnaire. And one of them was, on what occasion do you lie?
Yes.
That was
Very
interesting.
instructive. And now I cannot trust these bitches.
Some of the other questions we answered were the quality that we like most in men and the quality that we like most in women. And for some of us, it was the same. For some of us, it was different. So we'll put a link in the show notes. It's very pervy. I learned a lot about you two.
Thank you for listening to Australia's #1 news and pop culture show. This episode was produced by Emeline Gazilas. The assistant producer is Tahli Blackman, with audio production by Leah Porges.
Bye.
Shout out to any Mamamia subscribers listening. If you love the show and want to support us, subscribing to Mamamia is the best way to do so. There's a link in the episode description.